Hello, dear listener. Welcome back to Sleep Whisper. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your pillow, lie down comfortably, and gently close your eyes. Turn the volume to a soft level, just enough to hear my voice without strain. Let the world grow quiet around you and allow yourself to drift. Tonight, we start our journey with the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series. This one is called The Quiet Spread of Papermaking. If you enjoy these calm bedtime histories, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you many more quiet stories for peaceful nights. And now, let us begin. Long before paper became something so ordinary that we hardly notice it on our desks, in our bags, or in the hands of someone reading quietly by a window, there was a world where paper did not exist and where people relied on heavier, less practical materials to record their thoughts, their trade, and their memories. In early times, civilizations carved words into stone, pressed them onto clay tablets, or painted them on animal skins. These materials served their purpose, but they were cumbersome, expensive, and limited in how easily they could be copied or carried from one place to another. It is easy for us, lying here in silence, to forget how revolutionary paper once was, and how it spread across lands was neither loud nor dramatic, but rather a quiet unfolding that shaped human history in subtle ways. The origins of papermaking can be traced back to ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century of our era. Before the invention of paper, the Chinese used bamboo strips and silk as surfaces for writing. Bamboo, though abundant, was heavy when many strips were bound together into books, and silk, though smooth, was far too costly to be practical for everyday record keeping. The need for something more affordable and portable led to experimentation, and it is said that a court official named Kai Lun presented to the emperor a new kind of writing material made from plant fibers, bark, and old rags, mashed into a pulp, suspended in water, and then pressed and dried into thin sheets. This material was strong, yet light, inexpensive compared to silk, and easy to produce in larger quantities. Over time, papermaking slowly gained acceptance in China. At first it was reserved for official records and scholars, but as techniques improved and knowledge spread, merchants, artists, and ordinary people began to use it as well. The quiet strength of paper lay in its adaptability. It could hold calligraphy, it could carry drawings, it could serve as a medium for wrapping goods, or even be folded into simple forms. Paper did not shout its importance. It simply slipped into daily life and gradually replaced older materials that had once seemed irreplaceable. For centuries, papermaking remained largely a Chinese secret, carefully guarded because it gave such an advantage in administration and culture. Yet no invention can remain hidden forever, and through the slow currents of trade, war, and human migration, papermaking knowledge began its journey beyond the borders of China. The Silk Road, that long and winding network of routes connecting east and west, carried more than silk and spices. It carried stories, technologies, and ideas. Traders who traveled with goods also carried rumors of new materials, lighter than wood, cheaper than silk, capable of being produced in sheets that could be stored or carried easily. Eventually, papermaking knowledge reached Central Asia, likely through captured artisans after battles. By the 8th century, in the city of Samarkand, papermaking had taken root, and from there, it slowly spread to the Islamic world. The Arabs, skilled in science, literature, and administration, recognized the value of paper and developed their own refinements of the process. They built mills where fibers from linen rags were pulped and transformed into sheets, and they used these sheets to copy religious texts, poetry, and scientific treatises. In this way, paper began to anchor the intellectual life of a wide region. Libraries grew, knowledge was preserved, and ideas flowed more easily because the medium that carried them was lighter, cheaper, and easier to make than anything before. As centuries passed, the spread continued westward, reaching North Africa, Spain, and eventually the heart of Europe. Yet this story, the part we are beginning with tonight, focuses on the earliest moments, when paper was still new, when it was fragile, and when only a few understood its potential. It is a reminder that history often changes, not through sudden explosions, but through quiet, persistent shifts. Lying still, you may imagine the steady hands of those early papermakers dipping wooden frames into watery pulp, lifting them out with care, and setting the thin, wet sheets aside to dry. Each sheet represented possibility, the possibility of recording a poem, drafting an account of trade, or preserving the thoughts of a philosopher for generations. The quiet spread of papermaking did not come with trumpets or banners. It came with patient labor, with ripples of knowledge passing from one region to another, and with the human desire to leave a mark that would last beyond the fragile span of memory. Tonight, as you let your breathing slow and your mind wander, you can picture that ancient workshop, hear the dripping water, and feel the soft, steady rhythm of hands at work. That is where our story begins. The story of papermaking continued not with sudden leaps, but with the steady pace of human movement across lands, the slow rhythm of caravans making their way along the Silk Road, the shuffle of feet, the clatter of hooves, and the quiet exchange of goods, ideas, and techniques. When we think of the Silk Road, we often imagine only silk and spices, yet it was much more than that. It was a web that connected empires and cultures, where merchants, scholars, and wanderers met in bustling cities or dusty way stations, and where secrets could be passed from hand to hand without notice. It was along this path that papermaking knowledge began to leave China. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Chinese expansion and conflicts brought their artisans into contact with Central Asia. One famous account tells of the Battle of Talas in the year 751, where Chinese forces clashed with the Abbasid Caliphate. Among the prisoners taken were craftsmen, including papermakers, who carried with them the guarded skills of turning pulp into thin, durable sheets. In the city of Samarkand, a center of trade and culture in Central Asia, these skills found fertile ground. Samarkand was already a meeting point for merchants from many regions, known for its vibrant bazaars and its role as a cultural crossroad. When papermaking was introduced there, it did not vanish into obscurity, it adapted. And the people of Samarkand began to refine the techniques, making use of flax and linen rags as raw material. The pulp made from linen fibers produced a smoother, stronger paper, and the city soon became renowned for its production. Imagine, if you will, the quiet interior of a workshop in Samarkand. Sunlight filtering through narrow windows, men and women bending over vats of water and pulp, dipping wooden frames, shaking them gently to spread the fibers, and laying out sheets to dry in the warm air. The process was repetitive, almost meditative, and each finished sheet held the promise of words yet to be written. From Samarkand, papermaking knowledge spread further across the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate valued learning and record-keeping, and paper was quickly recognized as an essential tool. Libraries began to grow, filled with works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Scholars copied Greek texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, and they wrote their own treatises on science, law, and theology. The use of paper allowed for greater distribution of these works, since it was less costly than parchment and easier to handle than older materials. The city of Baghdad, founded in the 8th century as the capital of the Abbasids, became a thriving center of learning, sometimes called the House of Wisdom. In its libraries and study halls, scrolls and codices written on paper multiplied. Imagine scholars seated on low cushions, manuscripts spread before them, the quiet scratching of reeds on paper echoing in the room. Without paper, much of this copying and exchange would have been slower, more limited, perhaps even impossible. The gentle, almost invisible spread of papermaking was quietly fueling an age of intellectual brilliance. It is worth pausing to think how fragile this transfer was. A battle, a few artisans taken captive, a city open to new methods, and suddenly an invention that had been carefully guarded for centuries found new life in a different land. Yet this is often how history moves, through accidents, encounters, and the small decisions of individuals whose names are long forgotten. The people who dipped those frames in Samarkand, who pulped the linen rags, who spread the fibers into even sheets, likely had no thought of how important their labor would be for centuries to come. They were simply doing their work, filling a need, producing material for merchants and scribes. And yet the quiet spread continued. From Samarkand to Damascus, from Baghdad to Cairo, paper mills arose, and with each mill the reach of paper expanded. By the 10th century, paper was firmly established across the Islamic world. It had become not just a commodity, but a foundation for cultural life. Contracts were written, letters were exchanged, poems were recorded, and the administration of empires relied upon it. Compared to parchment, which required the labor of preparing animal skins, paper was faster and less costly to produce, and so it gradually replaced older methods. In this way, step by step, sheet by sheet, the spread of papermaking carried forward, never in a rush, always steady, always quiet, until its influence was woven into the very fabric of daily life. As you lie here in stillness, imagine the sheets of paper drying in the sun of Samarkand, the faint rustle of wind through their edges, the low murmur of voices in the workshops, and the silent growth of an invention that would change the world not through noise or spectacle, but through calm persistence. When papermaking took root in the Islamic world, it did not remain a simple craft practiced in quiet workshops. It became a foundation of what is often called the Islamic Golden Age, a period when science, philosophy, and literature flourished across vast regions stretching from Persia to Spain. The Abbasid Caliphate, ruling from Baghdad, recognized the usefulness of paper, not only for scholars, but for administration, record-keeping, and communication. Unlike the weighty scrolls of parchment or the fragile leaves of papyrus, paper was flexible, durable, and inexpensive, making it possible to expand bureaucracies, to collect taxes more efficiently, to maintain correspondence across provinces, and to preserve decrees and laws. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, became a symbol of this age, a place where scholars gathered to translate works from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions into Arabic. Without paper, this task would have been far more difficult. Yet with paper, texts could be copied many times, compared, commented upon, and shared with others. Imagine rooms filled with scribes, the air heavy with the smell of ink, the faint scratching sound of pens moving steadily across sheets. Each scribe focused on producing accurate copies, line after line, hour after hour. These copies were not only for the libraries of rulers, but also for scholars in distant cities who requested them, creating a network of learning sustained by the silent sheets of paper. In this environment, mathematics advanced, with algebra taking shape, astronomy flourished with detailed star charts, and medicine was preserved and developed through treatises that would later influence Europe. The beauty of paper was that it enabled both precision and volume. It could hold a simple letter or a vast commentary on Aristotle. It could be folded into a merchant's account book or bound into a philosopher's tome. Beyond the scholars, paper began to influence daily life. Markets recorded transactions, poets wrote verses to be shared at gatherings, children practiced their letters, and travelers carried notes across deserts and seas. The very fabric of society was gradually interlaced with sheets of paper, though few would have remarked upon it at the time. In cities such as Damascus and Cairo, paper mills multiplied. Linen rags were collected, sorted, pulped, and transformed into thin sheets. Water wheels powered hammers that broke down the fibers, and drying rooms were filled with rows of paper hung carefully to avoid warping. The process required patience, but once mastered, it could produce a steady supply to meet the growing demand. The spread of paper also changed the culture of books. While parchment had made books precious and rare, paper allowed for larger collections, and so libraries grew in size and accessibility. Scholars began to think in terms of preserving not just one copy, but many, ensuring that knowledge could not easily be lost. In Córdoba, in Islamic Spain, libraries were said to contain hundreds of thousands of volumes, an unimaginable number compared to the libraries of earlier ages. Each volume rested on sheets of paper, each sheet a quiet carrier of thought. The impact was not merely intellectual, but also artistic. Arabic calligraphy, already esteemed, found a new partner in paper. The smooth surface allowed for elegant strokes, for the flowing scripts that adorned both texts and decorative works. Paper became a medium not only of words but of beauty, a canvas for artistry as much as for administration. The influence spread gradually, without fanfare, as people became accustomed to paper in their daily lives. A student might not think twice about the sheet before him. A merchant might use it casually for his accounts, yet behind each sheet lay centuries of invention, capture, adaptation, and refinement. This is the quiet power of paper, that it transforms life without demanding attention. As you lie still and let your breathing deepen, picture those vast libraries, The rows of shelves heavy with volumes, the scholars seated in quiet rooms turning pages, and the sense of continuity that paper provided, allowing ideas to move not just across space, but through time. In the quiet spread of papermaking, the Islamic Golden Age found a vessel for its brilliance, and through this vessel, knowledge would be carried onward to new lands, waiting for the next chapter in its long journey. As the centuries unfolded, the quiet spread of papermaking continued its steady course westward, carried not by grand armies or sudden revolutions, but by merchants, artisans, and the subtle currents of cultural exchange. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the knowledge of papermaking had taken deep root in the Islamic world, and from there it began to make its way into the lands of Europe. The first real foothold came in Spain, where the city of Toledo became an early center for the production and use of paper. This was no accident, for Spain was under Islamic rule for many centuries, and through this connection, the techniques of papermaking crossed the cultural boundary. In Toledo and later in Valencia and Granada, mills were established that followed the methods refined in Damascus and Baghdad. Linen rags, once simple cast-offs from households, became valuable raw material, collected by rag merchants who supplied the growing industry. Imagine the quiet rhythm of water wheels turning, wooden hammers pounding fibers into pulp, and sheets hung in long rows to dry under the Iberian sun. These mills did not produce paper only for official documents, but also for the scholars of Spain who were busy translating Arabic texts into Latin. In this way, paper became the medium that allowed ancient Greek philosophy, preserved and expanded by Arabic scholars, to re-enter Europe. The quiet sheets carried the words of Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy into the hands of European readers who would later build upon them in the centuries to come. As paper gained a foothold in Spain, its spread continued through Sicily and into Italy. By the 12th century, cities like Palermo and Amalfi had their own mills, and Italian merchants, ever eager for trade, carried both paper and the knowledge of its production northward. Fabriano in central Italy became one of the most important centers of papermaking in Europe. There, artisans made significant innovations that would shape the industry for centuries. They introduced water-powered stamping mills, which made pulping rags more efficient, and they developed techniques for sizing paper with gelatin, which improved its durability and made it more suitable for both writing and painting. They also created distinctive watermarks by sewing wire patterns into the molds, leaving faint images in the finished sheets. These watermarks became both decoration and a form of identity, marking the origin of the paper and adding a subtle signature to each sheet. From Fabriano, paper spread into France and Germany, following the paths of trade and scholarship. Monasteries that had long relied on parchment slowly turned to paper as a cheaper and more abundant alternative, though at first some resisted, fearing that paper was too fragile to last. Yet the evidence soon proved otherwise, and by the late Middle Ages, paper was no longer a novelty, but a necessity. Imagine the scriptoria of monasteries, once filled with the smell of scraped animal hides, now lined with stacks of smooth paper sheets. The monks bent over their desks, dipped pens into ink, and let their thoughts flow across pages that were lighter and easier to handle. The Quiet Revolution was not dramatic, but it was profound. The availability of paper allowed for more books, more letters, more records, and in turn, more knowledge to be preserved and shared. Cities began to use paper for legal documents and contracts. Merchants kept accounts more carefully, and ordinary people found themselves able to afford writing materials for the first time. This gradual democratization of writing set the stage for future transformations, though few at the time could have foreseen just how powerful these thin sheets would become. Paper had crossed into Europe not with fanfare, but with patience, finding its place in the daily rhythms of life and laying the groundwork for the next great shift in human history, the coming of the printing press. For now, in the centuries before Gutenberg, Europe was quietly learning the value of paper, and the steady expansion of its use hinted at the vast changes that lay ahead. As you listen, picture the rows of drying sheets in an Italian mill, the faint imprint of a watermark glimmering in the light, and the calm persistence of an invention that was slowly, gently reshaping the world. By the 14th and 15th centuries, paper had already secured its place in Europe as a common material, no longer an exotic curiosity, but a practical necessity, woven into the life of cities, monasteries, merchants, and scholars. And yet the true magnitude of its importance had not yet been revealed. That would come with the invention of the printing press. But before that moment, Europe experienced a gradual transformation as paper became ever more abundant. In medieval towns, rag collectors moved quietly through the streets, gathering cast-off linen and woolen scraps from households, inns, and tailors. These humble rags, stained, worn, and no longer useful for clothing, were sold to paper mills where they were sorted, cleaned, and reduced to pulp. In a way, the paper that carried the knowledge of philosophers and poets was born from the everyday remnants of ordinary people's lives. The industry itself became more organized and professionalized. In places like Fabriano, Nuremberg, and Basel, guilds of papermakers developed, passing down techniques from master to apprentice. Workshops grew in size, with water-powered hammers pounding day and night, their steady rhythm echoing through valleys. Sheets were laid out in large drying lofts, the air filled with the rustle of fibers and the smell of wet pulp. For those who worked there, it was not glamorous labor, but it was steady, and the product of their toil became indispensable across Europe. Governments, eager to extend their administrative reach, increasingly turned to paper for official decrees, tax records, and correspondence. Universities, newly founded in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and elsewhere, relied on paper for teaching and study, as professors dictated lessons to students who scribbled on inexpensive sheets rather than on costly parchment. The shift was quiet but profound. Learning itself was becoming more widespread because the medium of recording knowledge was cheaper and more accessible. Libraries grew larger, not in sudden leaps, but through the steady accumulation of volumes, each one copied by hand onto paper. This was still a painstaking process, but the lower cost of materials meant that more books could be produced than ever before. Picture a scribe seated at his desk, candlelight flickering, his pen scratching across a page of smooth white paper. He is tired, his eyes strain in the dim light, but he persists because each sheet he fills carries forward knowledge that will outlive him. The paper beneath his hand is both ordinary and miraculous. Ordinary because it is now so widely used, miraculous because it preserves ideas beyond the fleeting span of a human life. At the same time, paper began to influence art. Painters and draftsmen found in it a flexible medium for sketches, plans, and preliminary designs. Architects drew blueprints on it, poets drafted verses, and musicians began to notate their compositions with greater ease. In this way, paper was quietly seeding the Renaissance, long before it burst into full bloom. Still, resistance lingered in some corners. Certain traditionalists argued that parchment was more durable and more fitting for sacred texts. They worried that paper, made from rags and water, could not last centuries. Yet over time, as documents survived and even thrived on paper, these doubts diminished. The quiet persistence of paper proved itself, and those who had once doubted came to accept its worth. By the mid-15th century, Europe was poised on the brink of change. The availability of paper meant that when Johannes Gutenberg developed his movable type printing press in Mainz, there was already an abundant, inexpensive, and reliable medium ready to receive the printed word. Without paper, the printing revolution would have been impossible, or at the very least drastically limited. With paper, the press could spread its products rapidly, multiplying books, pamphlets, and ideas across the continent. The stage was set, though most did not yet realize it. For now, in the decades before the press, Europe continued to write, copy, and create quietly, one sheet at a time, unaware that the true power of paper had not yet been unleashed. As you drift deeper into stillness, you may imagine the long drying lofts of a mill, the faint light touching rows upon rows of paper sheets, each one a blank surface, waiting for words that would soon reshape history. The quiet spread of papermaking had carried the world this far, and soon it would meet the force that would make its impact unstoppable. By the middle of the 15th century, the quiet presence of paper across Europe had already changed the way people wrote, studied, and governed. But its greatest test and triumph arrived when Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith from Mainz in Germany, perfected the technique of movable type printing. Gutenberg's press, first demonstrated around the year 1450, allowed individual letters made of metal to be arranged, inked, and pressed against sheets in a way that could be repeated thousands of times without the slow labor of scribes. It was a profound shift in human communication, yet one that depended entirely on paper being ready to receive the printed word. Without paper, the press would have been crippled, for parchment was too scarce and too costly for mass production. But paper was abundant, durable, and relatively cheap. Imagine the workshop in Mainz. Trays of type arranged neatly, apprentices inking the metal letters, a pressman turning the heavy screw that lowered the platen onto a sheet of waiting paper. Then the press opened, and there it was. Crisp black letters, uniform, sharp, and clear, repeated page after page with a precision no scribe could match. The famous Gutenberg Bible, produced in the early 1450s, stands as a monument to this union of paper and press. Its pages, still preserved in libraries today, carry the weight of history, not just in their words, but in their very existence, proof that a new era had begun. The spread of printing was swift, moving first to Cologne, Strasbourg, and Venice, then outward to Paris, London, and beyond. Each city that welcomed a press also required mills to supply paper, and so the two industries grew hand in hand. Paper mills expanded production, rag collectors intensified their efforts, and the demand for affordable writing materials soared. This was not a sudden explosion so much as an accelerating wave, a momentum that carried Europe into a new age of literacy. Books that had once been rare treasures began to multiply. Where a monastery library might have held a few hundred volumes, within decades universities and cities boasted collections numbering in the thousands. Scholars could now own their own books. Students could study from copies. Merchants could read manuals, and ordinary citizens could eventually purchase pamphlets or devotional texts. The ripple effects touched every aspect of life. Political tracts could be distributed, religious debates could be fueled, and scientific discoveries could be shared far more widely than ever before. All of this was possible because each press had a steady supply of paper, sheet after sheet, waiting to be filled. The quiet spread of papermaking now intersected with the noisier revolution of printing, and together they changed the course of human history. Consider how fragile this chain of events truly was. An invention born in Han China, carried to Central Asia through war, nurtured in Samarkand, refined in Baghdad and Damascus, adopted in Spain and Italy, then waiting patiently in Europe until Gutenberg's press arrived. Each link depended on the one before it, and together they formed a path that led to a world where knowledge could circulate with unprecedented speed. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, presses multiplied across the continent, and with them paper mills. Entire valleys in Italy, France, and Germany became devoted to the production of paper, their streams diverted to power hammers, their workshops filled with the steady labor of men and women who likely did not think of themselves as making history, yet whose efforts supplied the material upon which history was written. The sheets they produced carried the words of Luther and Erasmus, of Copernicus and Galileo, of poets and playwrights, of explorers writing of new lands across the ocean. In the dim light of a print shop or the bright sun of a drawing loft, paper and press together made ideas immortal. Tonight, as you lie in stillness and allow your mind to wander, imagine the slow turning of a press, the creak of wood, the firm impression of ink upon paper, and the quiet satisfaction of those who held in their hands not just one book, but the possibility of countless others. The story of papermaking had reached its greatest companion, and together they reshaped the destiny of the world in ways that no one in that workshop in Mainz could fully have imagined. As the printing press spread rapidly across Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries, it encountered a continent that was already restless with curiosity, longing for rediscovery, and eager to learn, and paper became the silent partner that made this explosion of knowledge possible. The Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and philosophy, unfolded not only in the studios of Florence and the palaces of Venice, but also in the quiet turning of printed pages. The affordability of paper meant that ideas no longer remained trapped in the rare parchment manuscripts of monasteries or the guarded scrolls of elite scholars. Instead, they flowed outward in printed books, carried across cities, across borders, and across generations. Imagine a merchant in Venice, once limited to oral stories and the occasional handwritten document, now able to purchase a printed book explaining geography or mathematics. Picture a student in Paris, sitting by candlelight, poring over a Latin text that only a few decades earlier would have been nearly impossible for him to own. Consider the scholars of Florence debating Plato and Aristotle, not from fragile single copies, but from multiple printed editions, their margins filled with notes and commentaries. Paper was the medium that made this exchange possible, a quiet surface that gave voice to the thinkers of the age. The Renaissance artists, too, though celebrated for their works in marble and paint, relied heavily on paper for sketches, designs, and plans. Leonardo da Vinci filled countless sheets with diagrams of machines, studies of anatomy, and notes in his mirrored script. Michelangelo drafted his visions of the Sistine Chapel ceiling on paper before climbing the scaffolding to paint them. The works of art that define the Renaissance in our minds were first whispered onto sheets of paper, fragile yet enduring. At the same time, humanist scholars traveled to monasteries and libraries in search of forgotten manuscripts, bringing them into the light of the New Age by copying and printing them on paper. This allowed the works of Cicero, Virgil, and many others to be reborn and to influence the thinking of Renaissance Europe. The quiet spread of papermaking had made possible a loud rebirth of culture. The impact was not only artistic and scholarly, but also deeply practical. Paper allowed merchants to keep better records, explorers to map coastlines with greater precision, and governments to maintain more extensive bureaucracies. The voyages of discovery that carried Europeans across the Atlantic and around the globe were charted and recorded on sheets of paper, their maps folded into the hands of captains who would steer their ships by them. Contracts for trade, treaties between nations, and letters describing distant lands all relied on paper. The world itself was being bound together in ways both visible and invisible by these thin sheets that could carry ink across oceans and through time. With the rise of literacy, paper also entered the lives of ordinary people more directly. Printed pamphlets spread news and opinion, devotional texts guided private prayer, and ballads circulated stories and songs. People who might never have touched parchment could now hold paper, read it, and even write upon it themselves. The democratization of knowledge that historians often point to as the defining feature of the Renaissance was inseparable from the spread of paper. It was not a revolution announced with drums and trumpets, but a slow unfolding that touched every corner of life. And so, as the 16th century progressed, Europe became a continent of books, of letters, of paper-filled shelves and desks. Libraries grew not only in palaces and universities, but also in towns and guilds, and even in the homes of wealthy merchants. The written word had become a daily presence, and with it the thoughts of one generation could be carried forward to the next with unprecedented ease. Tonight, as you rest and allow your mind to drift, you can imagine walking through a Renaissance library, shelves heavy with volumes, the air filled with the scent of ink and parchment bindings, the soft rustle of pages as readers turn them slowly. Every one of those books depended on paper, every idea preserved by its fibers, every thought waiting silently until eyes would fall upon it once more. The Renaissance, so often remembered for its brilliance and grandeur, was also a quiet story of paper, spreading softly through time and space, shaping the world without ever demanding attention. As the 15th century drew to its close and the 16th century began, Europe stood at the threshold of what is often called the Age of Exploration, a period when ships left familiar shores to cross vast oceans and when new lands, peoples, and trade routes were brought into contact with one another. And throughout this age, paper was always present, though rarely noticed, the silent companion of discovery. Mariners setting out from Portugal and Spain did not rely solely on memory or oral instruction. They carried with them charts, maps, and logs, all drawn and written on sheets of paper. These maps were fragile yet invaluable, guiding sailors through unfamiliar waters and recording coastlines that had never before been traced by European hands. When Columbus sailed westward in 1492, he took with him charts and notes on paper, and when he returned, he recorded his observations, his claims, and his requests to the Spanish crown on the same medium. Paper, light and portable, was the vessel of communication between explorers and their patrons. As voyages multiplied, so too did the need for paper. Letters describing the riches of the Indies, reports of newly encountered peoples, contracts granting rights to trade or conquer, and treaties dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal, all were committed to paper. Imagine the long wooden tables of royal chancelleries, clerks bent over piles of documents, quills moving steadily as they recorded each new claim each new order, each new decree. The expansion of empires was carried not only by ships and soldiers, but also by these quiet sheets that bound promises, defined boundaries, and preserved words. The growth of cartography in this period was made possible by paper. As explorers traced coastlines and rivers, their notes were transferred to larger charts, corrected, expanded, and copied. Paper allowed maps to circulate among navigators and merchants, gradually turning the unknown edges of the world into familiar lines and shapes. Consider the workshops of mapmakers in Venice or Antwerp, crowded with compasses, rulers, and stacks of paper, where apprentices carefully inked coastlines and filled in seas with drawings of ships and sea monsters. These maps were not just tools of navigation, but also symbols of ambition, proof of knowledge, and invitations to further exploration. Paper also played a role in spreading the stories of discovery to the wider public. Printed accounts of voyages, translated into multiple languages, found eager audiences across Europe. Readers who would never see the Caribbean or the Pacific could imagine them through words set down on paper. These accounts stirred imagination, fueled desire for wealth, and justified conquests, shaping perceptions for generations. In this way, paper connected the personal experience of a sailor with the distant curiosity of a reader in Paris, London, or Nuremberg. The age of exploration also highlighted the darker side of paper's power. Decrees authorizing conquest, documents legitimizing slavery, and contracts granting monopolies were all inscribed on sheets that carried the authority of kings and queens. Paper was a neutral medium, yet the words it bore could shape destinies, bringing suffering or opportunity, depending on the hand that held the pen. Still, beyond conquest and commerce, paper also allowed for the exchange of knowledge. Plants, animals, and minerals from distant lands were sketched and described on paper, becoming the foundation of new sciences. Missionaries recorded languages and customs, preserving details that might otherwise have been forgotten. The paper carried both curiosity and control, reflecting the complexity of an age when worlds collided. Tonight, as you allow yourself to sink into stillness, imagine the cabin of a ship rolling gently on the Atlantic waves, a navigator hunched over a small desk, a candle flickering, ink staining his fingers as he marks his course on a map spread before him. Outside, the sea is endless, the horizon uncertain, yet inside, on that fragile sheet of paper, there is order, direction, and hope. The age of exploration was built upon daring, upon ships and winds, but also upon paper, quietly spreading across oceans, binding together distant worlds in ink and fiber. By the 17th and 18th centuries, paper had already carried Europe through the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, but its quiet presence was about to fuel another transformation, one that reshaped not only art and science, but the very ways people thought about society, government, and human rights. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a time when philosophers and thinkers spread ideas of reason, liberty, and progress. And once again, paper was the vessel that made this exchange possible. Imagine the crowded coffeehouses of London or Paris, where citizens gathered to drink bitter cups and debate the news of the day. On the tables before them lay newspapers and pamphlets printed on paper, filled with reports, essays, and opinions. These were not rare treasures for scholars alone. They were cheap, quickly printed, and widely distributed, reaching merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary readers who hungered for knowledge. The rise of periodicals, made possible by abundant paper, created a new rhythm of information. News no longer traveled only by word of mouth or the occasional proclamation nailed to a door. It arrived weekly, even daily, on sheets that could be folded, carried, and read aloud. The world seemed to move faster, its events recorded and shared with an immediacy never before possible. Pamphlets, small and inexpensive, became weapons of persuasion. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu saw their works copied and circulated across Europe, each sheet of paper carrying arguments about freedom of thought, the nature of government, and the rights of man. These ideas, fragile in origin, found strength in multiplication. Where once a single manuscript might influence a handful of readers, now thousands of copies could spread through cities and villages, igniting conversations in parlors and workshops alike. The quiet spread of paper made possible the loud debates of the Enlightenment. In scientific circles, paper also played a crucial role. the Royal Society in England, the Académie des Sciences in France, and countless other institutions relied on journals printed on paper to share discoveries. Astronomers recorded their observations of the heavens, naturalists described new species, and mathematicians demonstrated theorems. Each contribution was printed, distributed, and preserved, creating a living dialogue across borders. Paper allowed one scientist to build on the work of another, accelerating progress in a way that no single library of manuscripts ever could. Even the great encyclopedias of the 18th century, such as Diderot's Encyclopédie, which sought to gather all human knowledge, depended entirely on paper. Without paper's relative affordability and flexibility, such monumental projects would have been unthinkable. As revolutions brewed, paper again was at the center. In the American colonies, pamphlets such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense spread arguments for independence, each copy read, reread, and passed from hand to hand. In France, revolutionary papers carried demands for liberty and equality, spreading unrest through cities and countryside alike. The power of paper was not in its fibers, but in the words it bore. Words that could topple kings, inspire nations, and change the course of history. Yet even in these tumultuous times, paper remained a quiet companion. It did not shout, it did not command. It merely offered itself as a surface, a carrier, a silent witness. Tonight, as you listen and allow your thoughts to drift, you can imagine the dimly lit workshops of printers in the 18th century, presses creaking, ink staining hands, and stacks of paper growing steadily beside them. Outside, streets echoed with debates, revolutions, and new ideas. But inside those workshops, the quiet rhythm of labor continued, one sheet after another, feeding a world hungry for change. The Enlightenment is often remembered as an age of great thinkers, but it was also an age of paper. For without paper, the words of those thinkers would never have spread so far, so fast, or so deeply. By the dawn of the 19th century, the quiet journey of papermaking, which had begun with simple pulp in Han China and traveled silently through Samarkand, Baghdad, Toledo, and Mainz, entered yet another transformation, this time driven by the forces of industry. For centuries, paper had been made by hand, one sheet at a time, with artisans dipping wooden molds into vats of pulp, shaking them gently to spread the fibers, and then laying the wet sheets to dry. It was steady, careful, and laborious. But the Industrial Revolution brought machines that changed this process forever. In the early 1800s, French inventors Louis-Nicolas Robert and the Fourdrinier brothers in England developed the continuous papermaking machine, capable of producing long rolls of paper instead of individual sheets. No longer limited to the rhythm of hands and frames, papermaking entered a new era of scale and speed. The demand was immense. Growing populations, expanding literacy, and the rise of public education created an insatiable need for books, newspapers, and official records. With steam-powered presses rolling day and night, millions of words could be printed and distributed. But all of it required a constant supply of paper. Mills multiplied, rivers were harnessed to power machinery, and forests were harvested to supply fiber when rags could no longer meet demand. For the first time, wood pulp began to replace linen and cotton as the primary raw material. The shift was controversial, as some feared wood pulp paper would not endure as well as rag paper, but the pressure of demand made the transition inevitable. By the mid-19th century, entire industries revolved around the harvesting, pulping, and bleaching of wood for paper. Imagine vast mills with enormous machines, rollers pressing endless sheets, steam rising, workers monitoring the flow of pulp through metal cylinders. The quiet craft of earlier centuries had become a thunderous industrial process, yet the result was still the same: thin sheets ready to bear ink. The availability of cheap paper fueled revolutions of its own kind. Daily newspapers reached mass audiences, spreading news, opinion, and entertainment to millions. Cheap novels, sometimes called penny dreadfuls or dime novels, carried stories to readers who had never before been able to afford books. Political movements used pamphlets and posters to rally support. Scientific societies distributed journals on an unprecedented scale. Paper had become not only common but essential, a background presence in nearly every life. Letters connected families separated by oceans. Legal documents underpinned growing nations, and textbooks guided children in classrooms from Boston to Berlin. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, paper's reach expanded even further, supporting the explosion of bureaucracy, the rise of advertising, the spread of magazines, and the growth of global communication. Trains and steamships carried newspapers to distant regions, while telegraphs transmitted urgent news that was then printed and read within hours. Paper became the record of wars, the medium of treaties, the canvas of art movements, and the packaging of goods in industrial society. Even as typewriters clattered and telephones rang, paper remained indispensable, absorbing the flow of human thought in a way no other medium yet could. And though today, in the digital age, screens glow with words and images, paper still lingers in our lives. Books, letters, notebooks, and documents endure, their weight in the hand a reminder of continuity. When you open a book, the feel of its pages connects you quietly to centuries of invention, labor, and history. Tonight, as you rest and let your breathing grow slow, you can imagine the long journey of paper. From a Chinese court official presenting a new material to his emperor, to artisans in Samarkand dipping frames into vats, to scribes in Baghdad copying ancient texts, to printers in mines turning screws on a press, to Renaissance scholars filling margins with notes, to Enlightenment thinkers spreading pamphlets of revolution, and finally to the roaring mills of the industrial age. Each sheet, whether made by hand or machine, carried the same quiet promise: to hold thought, to preserve memory, to spread knowledge. The story of paper is the story of humanity's desire to be remembered, to communicate, to reach across time and space. And even now, as the world grows digital, the whisper of turning pages reminds us that paper's quiet spread has not ended. It continues, softly, persistently, carrying our words, our dreams, and our history forward. And so, our previous story has come to an end. Before we move on, if you are enjoying these calm journeys through history, please take a moment to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these quiet stories flowing night after night. Now, let us continue with the next tale in our series of boring histories for sleep as we arrive at the monotony of Roman aqueduct maintenance. When one imagines the grandeur of Rome, it is easy to think of marble temples gleaming in the sun, of senators debating in the forum, of soldiers marching beneath triumphal arches, or of gladiators fighting for glory in the Colosseum. Yet beneath all of this magnificence, there lay something far quieter, far less celebrated, but equally essential: the constant, never-ending maintenance of Rome's aqueducts. These vast channels of stone and mortar stretched for miles across the countryside, carrying fresh water from distant springs into the heart of the city. Without them, Rome could not have grown to its great size, could not have supported its baths, fountains, latrines, and households. But unlike statues or conquests, aqueducts required care, steady, methodical, monotonous care, performed day after day by workers whose names are lost to history. Imagine standing outside the city in the still morning air, watching as a trickle of water runs through a channel guided by the gentle slope engineered centuries ago. The aqueducts were marvels of precision, built with gradients so slight that water moved almost imperceptibly, yet consistently across valleys and hills. To the casual observer, they seemed eternal, but to those responsible for them, they were fragile, vulnerable to the slow accumulation of debris, to the growth of algae, to the crumbling of stones, and to the shifting of earth beneath their arches. Thus, maintenance was constant. Teams of men walked the lengths of the channels, scraping lime deposits from the walls, clearing weeds that sprouted in cracks, repairing stones that had loosened in storms or earthquakes. It was not glamorous work. There were no cheering crowds, no songs of praise. Instead, there was silence broken only by the scrape of tools, the drip of water, the murmur of voices as workers discussed their tasks. Inscriptions and records show us that Rome employed a corps of aquarii, watermen, whose lives were spent in this labor. They inspected flow rates, opened and closed sluice gates, and ensured that water reached its destinations. They worked under the authority of curatores aquarum, officials tasked with overseeing the supply, a position so important that it was often given to men of senatorial rank. Yet the officials relied on the endless, repetitive efforts of common workers who trudged along the channels in sun and rain, in summer heat and winter chill to keep Rome's lifeblood flowing. Consider the monotony of it. Day after day, scraping away mineral deposits, hauling stones into place, checking levels with simple tools, and walking mile after mile along the same routes. The aqueducts from the Aqua Appia, Rome's first built in the 4th century BCE, to the later Aqua Claudia and Anio Novus, were vast, and their upkeep demanded constant vigilance. A small crack left unattended could widen, water could leak, pressure could build, and suddenly a section might collapse, cutting off supply to an entire district. And so, vigilance was everything, and vigilance required patience. As you let your mind rest tonight, imagine one of those workers, rising before dawn, gathering his tools, and setting out along the aqueduct. The city stirs behind him, but his world is the quiet sound of flowing water, the rhythmic motion of his feet on stone, the repetitive motions of repair. He knows no glory will come of this, but he also knows that the baths of Caracalla, the fountains of the Forum, and the cisterns of homes depend on his work. In a way, Rome's grandeur rested on the shoulders of men like him, men who endured the monotony of aqueduct maintenance so that others could enjoy the luxuries of clean water. Tonight, as you listen, picture the long lines of arches stretching into the distance, the steady trickle of water within them, and the silent persistence of those who kept them alive. Their labor was not celebrated in marble or in verse, but without it, the eternal city could not have endured. The daily life of those who maintained Rome's aqueducts was not one of glory, but of routine, a cycle that repeated with little variation from one day to the next, a rhythm of labor that required attentiveness, endurance, and a tolerance for monotony. Each morning, workers known as equarii and their assistants rose early, often before the sun lifted above the hills, gathered their simple tools, chisels, hammers, wooden buckets, brushes, and measuring rods, and set out along the long stone channels. Their task was deceptively simple, to ensure that water continued to flow smoothly and cleanly into the city. But this task demanded countless small acts of diligence. Along the open-air channels, mineral deposits gradually formed as calcium carbonate settled out of the water, building up into rough scales that narrowed the flow. Day after day, men chipped at these encrustations, scraping away layers of stone-hard residue so that the stream could move unhindered. In shaded stretches, algae and moss clung stubbornly to the damp surfaces, making the channels slippery and choking the current, so brushes were used to scrub them away. In areas where soil had shifted or stones had loosened, cracks appeared and water began to leak. These were patched with mortar carried in heavy baskets, a messy, back-breaking job that required patience and precision. The work was often carried out in silence, broken only by the steady scrape of metal against stone, the trickle of water, and the occasional low conversation between laborers. Walking the length of an aqueduct could mean many miles under the open sky, the sun beating down in summer, or cold winds sweeping across the arches in winter. The monotony was numbing, the same view of stone walls, the same tasks of scraping and patching, the same rhythm of footsteps echoing in narrow passages. Yet the men knew that neglecting even a small section could spell disaster. A blocked channel could deprive a district of water, and a collapsed arch could cut off supplies to an entire bath complex or marketplace. Supervisors kept records of flow rates, measuring the amount of water reaching each distribution tank. Wooden markers or simple notched sticks were sometimes used to gauge levels. If discrepancies were found, if one bathhouse received less water than expected, or if fountains flowed weakly, then workers were dispatched to investigate, walking back along the line until they found the obstruction or leak. These inspections were constant, for the aqueduct system of Rome was vast, comprising hundreds of miles of channels, tunnels, bridges, and pipes. Some aqueducts ran underground, requiring workers to crawl through narrow, damp tunnels with torches in hand, checking for cracks and clearing debris. The darkness, the dripping water, the confined space made this a particularly unpleasant duty, yet it was unavoidable. Others labored high above the ground, walking along the tops of monumental arcades, balancing as they checked for leaks. The city spread out below them. For the common laborer, there was little difference between one day and the next. He rose, he walked, he scraped, he patched, and he returned home weary, his hands raw, his clothes damp from spray. There was no praise, no celebration, only the quiet knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same again. Yet in that monotony lay necessity, for Rome depended utterly on these men and their endless repetition of tasks. Without their work, the baths would run dry, the fountains would cease, the latrines would stink, and the people would thirst. As you allow yourself to drift, imagine one such man, his footsteps echoing along the stone, his chisel ringing faintly as he chips away at a stubborn deposit, the water flowing beside him with a sound so ordinary, yet so essential. He is not remembered in marble or in history books, but in his quiet persistence, he helped sustain the eternal city. The aqueducts may have been celebrated as marvels of engineering, but it was the daily grind of maintenance that kept them alive. To understand the endless cycle of aqueduct maintenance in Rome, it is important to imagine not only the workers, but also the simple tools they carried, and the way their labor was organized into an efficient, if monotonous, system. Each Aquarius or waterman relied on a set of implements that were humble but effective. Chisels and hammers, often made of iron, were used to chip away at thick mineral deposits clinging to the stone channels. Wooden scrapers and stiff brushes cleared moss and algae from damp surfaces, while small buckets and sponges helped scoop debris or absorb water pooling in cracks. Mortar, mixed from lime and sand, was carried in heavy baskets or clay jars, and applied with trowels to seal leaks or rebuild weakened joints between stones. For larger repairs, stones had to be hauled into place, requiring pulleys and wooden scaffolding erected along sections of arches. Nothing about these tools was sophisticated, yet in their repetition they accomplished the quiet miracle of keeping Rome's water flowing. The workers were not alone, for the scale of the aqueduct system demanded organization. Overseeing the entire network was the curator aquarum, an official often of senatorial rank, who reported directly to the emperor. Beneath him were procuratores, supervisors responsible for specific aqueducts or regions, and beneath them a host of aquarii, inspectors, and laborers. Records were kept of flow rates, usage, and maintenance schedules, sometimes inscribed on stone tablets or recorded in scrolls stored in offices within the city. Teams were assigned to patrol particular stretches of channel, while others focused on reservoirs, settling tanks, or distribution points where water was divided among baths, fountains, and households. The division of labor was precise but repetitive, ensuring that no section went unchecked for long. Imagine the monotony of a team assigned to walk the same 10-mile stretch each week, noting minor leaks, scraping the same algae, patching the same stones again and again. The pace was slow, deliberate, and rarely interrupted, except when storms or earthquakes forced sudden major repairs. In those moments, the system revealed its fragility. A collapsed arch could take weeks to rebuild, and during that time, whole neighborhoods might be deprived of water. Inscriptions from antiquity show gratitude to emperors who funded major restorations, but behind those public gestures were armies of anonymous laborers whose sweat mixed with mortar as they reset stones under the sun. The methods of inspection were themselves basic but effective. Water levels were gauged with rods, flow rates observed by timing how quickly basins filled, and sometimes simple floats were used to detect irregularities. If the water slowed, inspectors knew deposits were narrowing the channel. If the stream appeared cloudy, sediment had gathered and needed to be cleared. If the sound of dripping echoed beneath an arch, there was a leak that must be sealed. Each observation led to a task, each task to another cycle of scraping, patching, or reinforcing. The monotony was absolute, and yet through this steady vigilance, the aqueducts endured for centuries. Consider the Aqua Marcia, built in the 2nd century BCE, which carried water nearly 60 miles into Rome. Its survival depended less on its original builders than on the countless men who trudged along its length for generations, hammering, sealing, and clearing. Their names are unknown, their work forgotten, yet their persistence allowed emperors to bathe in marble halls and commoners to drink from public fountains. As you drift deeper into calm, picture those men in simple tunics, bent beneath the weight of tools, walking mile after mile along stone channels, their hands rough, their bodies weary, their voices low. Around them, the water flowed, a sound constant and unremarkable, yet it was their labor that kept it moving. The tools were crude, the methods repetitive, the organization hierarchical, but together they formed a system that sustained the eternal city. Paper may preserve the glory of emperors and generals, But the aqueducts remind us that history also rests on the shoulders of those who endured monotony in service of necessity. While the great arches of Roman aqueducts impressed travelers approaching the city, the real heart of the system lay not only in the countryside, but within the city itself, in the settling tanks, reservoirs, and distribution points where the water was received, stored, and then quietly divided into countless channels that fed fountains, baths, and private homes. Maintaining these points was as important as maintaining the long channels, and it demanded its own endless routine of inspection and repair. At the end of many aqueducts stood a castellum aquae, a water distribution tank, usually a rectangular or circular structure of stone. Water flowed in at one end, settled briefly, and then passed out through multiple pipes that carried it to different parts of the city. Each pipe might serve a public fountain, a wealthy household, or a great bath complex. The tanks often had 3 outlets, one for the public supply, one for the baths, and one for the private elite, though this division was not always respected, and corruption sometimes diverted more water to wealthy patrons. For the workers tasked with maintenance, the challenge was to ensure that water flowed evenly and that blockages or leaks did not cripple the system. Sediment collected at the bottom of tanks, requiring periodic cleaning. Silt, algae, and debris would be scraped out by men descending into the damp interior with buckets and shovels, working by the light of small oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on wet walls. Pipes, often made of lead, sometimes cracked or became clogged, and had to be replaced or patched. The joints where pipes entered the stone walls were points of constant concern, as leaks could erode mortar and create larger failures. Imagine the monotony of a worker standing knee-deep in cold water, scooping handful after handful of grit into a bucket, hauling it up, dumping it, and repeating the task for hours until the tank was clean. Reservoirs required the same vigilance. These larger storage basins, sometimes open air, sometimes roofed, gathered water before it entered the city, allowing heavier particles to settle. Birds might foul the open ones, leaves would drift in, and stagnant sections bred algae. Workers walked the perimeters, removing debris, repairing cracks in the walls, and occasionally draining entire sections for thorough cleaning. The work was necessary, for contaminated water could spread disease, and uneven flow could leave districts dry. The great baths of Rome, such as the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian, consumed vast amounts of water daily, and so their supply had to be constant. Inspectors ensured that the castellums serving these complexes delivered steady flow. If not, urgent messages were sent to repair crews who would search the aqueduct line for obstructions. In a city of over 1 million people, water was both a necessity and a luxury, and the endless labor of maintenance ensured it was always available. Even the fountains, which seemed so effortless in their bubbling flow, required hidden labor. Valves and outlets became clogged with lime, needing regular clearing. Stone basins cracked from use and weathering, demanding repair. To the Roman citizen, dipping a jug into a fountain was an ordinary act. But behind that act lay miles of aqueducts and the monotonous toil of workers who kept every connection intact. It is easy to picture Rome as a city of grandeur, but it was also a city of infrastructure, one that depended utterly on the silent persistence of maintenance crews. Night and day, they checked levels, patched pipes, scraped tanks, and kept the lifeblood of the city moving. Tonight, as you rest, imagine one of these men standing in the dim interior of a castellum, the sound of dripping water echoing around him, his hands raw from scraping, his back aching, yet his work unnoticed by the world outside. Without him, the fountains would cease, the baths would empty, and the city would falter. His was not the glory of emperors, but the monotony of necessity, and through it Rome endured. The aqueducts of Rome, though masterpieces of engineering, were never free from the slow but relentless forces of nature. And for those tasked with their upkeep, the struggle was not against enemies or rivals, but against rain, wind, earth, and stone. Each year brought new challenges, storms that swelled rivers and undercut foundations, earthquakes that cracked arches, summer heat that dried mortar, winter frosts that split stones. The monotony of maintenance was punctuated by these trials, but the response was always the same: methodical, repetitive, necessary. Picture a long arcade of the Aqua Claudia stretching across a valley, its arches rising high, majestic from a distance, yet fragile up close. Heavy rains caused the soil beneath one pier to shift, and suddenly the stones no longer rested securely. A fissure appeared, water began to seep through, and inspectors marked the spot. Within days, crews arrived, hauling baskets of mortar, chisels, and spare stones. They erected wooden scaffolding, clambered upward, and began the laborious work of filling cracks, reinforcing joints, and ensuring the arch would stand another season. Nothing about the task was dramatic, and yet the survival of the aqueduct depended upon it. Earthquakes posed an even greater threat. Italy lies along restless faults, and tremors occasionally shook the ground, toppling sections of channels or misaligning joints so that water spilled uselessly into fields. When this happened, entire stretches had to be rebuilt. For the workers, it meant weeks or months of repetitive hauling, lifting, and sealing, a routine of exhaustion under the gaze of officials eager to restore flow. Floods too played their part. Rivers that aqueducts crossed on bridges could swell with spring rains, eroding piers and depositing debris against their bases. Workers waded into muddy water to clear branches and silt, their bodies chilled, their clothes heavy, their motion slow but steady. In the mountains, snowmelt added torrents to streams, scouring channels and leaving deposits that had to be scraped away. Even in calm seasons, nature left its mark. Weeds rooted themselves in the mortar of walls, their roots prying stones apart. Birds nested in crevices, their droppings fouling the water. Wind carried dust that settled and thickened the layers of deposit within channels. Against all this, the Aquarii and their teams fought with the same tools day after day: chisels to scrape, brushes to clear, mortar to patch. There was no final victory, only the endless cycle of wear and repair. Imagine the monotony of returning to the same stretch of channel year after year, sealing the same cracks that reappeared with every winter frost, scraping the same deposits that returned each spring. The work was thankless, but neglect was impossible. A lapse meant shortages, and shortages meant unrest. Rome depended utterly on its water, and its water depended on men who fought time itself with hammers and buckets. In truth, the aqueducts were as much living systems as they were structures, requiring constant tending like gardens. And so the workers endured, walking their rounds in sun and rain, responding to storms and quakes, patching and scraping as if their lives had no other rhythm. Tonight, as your mind drifts into calm, picture one of these men, his feet sinking into wet soil by a riverbank, his chisel striking stone again and again, the sound lost in the rush of water. Around him, the aqueduct towers above, ancient yet vulnerable, dependent on his monotonous effort to survive another day. The grandeur of Rome may seem eternal, but beneath it lay this quiet struggle against nature, waged not with glory, but with persistence. Behind the endless scraping, patching, and hauling that kept Rome's aqueducts alive, there stood another layer of monotony, the bureaucracy that administered the water supply. From the late Republic onward, and especially under the Empire, the management of aqueducts became an official responsibility, overseen by men of high rank called curatores aquarum, who were supported by clerks, inspectors, and the water workers themselves. Records had to be kept of flow rates, allocations, repairs, and costs, all inscribed on tablets or scrolls and filed away in offices where scribes copied numbers and names with patient strokes. The administration of water was in many ways as repetitive and tedious as its physical maintenance, filled with measurements, reports, and disputes. Imagine an official seated at his desk in a shaded Roman office, reading through figures that noted how many quinae of water flowed through a given pipe, how much was allotted to the baths of one district, how much was diverted to fountains, and whether the supply matched the official allocation decreed by the emperor. These records mattered because Rome's water was not distributed equally. By law and tradition, public fountains and baths were supposed to receive priority, ensuring that ordinary citizens had access to clean water. Yet in practice, private individuals, especially the wealthy and influential, often found ways to increase their share. Pipes were secretly tapped, outlets widened, or extra channels added, siphoning water away from its intended destinations. Corruption crept in quietly, with bribes given to inspectors to overlook illegal diversions or to adjust records. The monotony of maintenance was mirrored by the monotony of corruption, for it was not dramatic or sudden, but slow, constant, and insidious. For the ordinary worker trudging along the aqueduct, the politics of distribution mattered little. His task was simply to keep the water flowing. But for city dwellers, especially the poor, shortages at fountains were keenly felt, and anger could rise quickly. Emperors understood this, which is why positions like curator aquarum were entrusted to men of senatorial or equestrian rank, whose prestige lent authority to the system. They were expected to maintain not only the structures but also public trust. Yet even their vigilance could not eliminate abuse. Frontinus, who served as water commissioner under the Emperor Nerva in the 1st century CE, left us a detailed account of Rome's aqueducts in his treatise De Aqueductu Urbis Romae. In it, he describes the constant problem of illegal tapping and the measures taken to prevent it. He writes of inspectors uncovering secret pipes drilled into main channels, of fines imposed, and of repairs made to restore proper flow. His words reveal not only technical details, but also the constant struggle against human greed. Maintaining aqueducts was therefore not just a matter of mortar and stone, but also of law and order. Bureaucrats had to patrol as much as laborers did, walking the city, comparing allocations, checking outlets, and writing endless reports. Their days were filled with numbers and disputes. Their nights with the knowledge that tomorrow the same problems would arise again. Imagine the monotony of copying figures onto tablets, of recalculating flows, of interviewing citizens who complained that their fountains ran dry, while wealthy houses enjoyed steady streams. There was no end to it, only the endless cycle of oversight and correction. And yet, through this blend of bureaucracy, vigilance, and labor, the water continued to flow. Rome's grandeur, its baths, fountains, and gardens, depended not only on the skill of engineers, but also on the persistence of administrators and the occasional honesty of inspectors. Tonight, as you listen and drift, picture both sides of the system. The worker scraping lime from a channel under the sun, and the official bent over his desk in the cool interior of an office, tallying figures, stamping documents, and filing reports. Both endured monotony, one physical, one bureaucratic, yet both were necessary to keep the lifeblood of Rome moving quietly, day after day, century after century. For the ordinary citizens of Rome, the aqueducts were not marvels to be admired from afar, but the silent arteries that sustained daily routines. And although the people seldom thought of the workers trudging along distant channels or the officials tallying figures in dim offices, every moment of their lives was quietly shaped by the flow of water. To understand the monotony of maintenance, one must also imagine the monotony of use, for water entered into the most ordinary actions of the Roman day. At dawn, household slaves might fill jugs at the nearest public fountain, carrying them back through narrow streets to supply kitchens where bread was kneaded and pots of porridge simmered. The fountains themselves, often decorated with simple basins of stone, gurgled steadily, fed by the aqueducts that stretched miles away. If deposits clogged a pipe, the stream slowed to a trickle, and housewives murmured complaints. But if the workers had done their scraping and patching, the flow was steady and unnoticed. In the great baths of Rome, water shaped leisure and hygiene alike. The baths of Caracalla and Diocletian were vast complexes where thousands bathed daily, moving through pools of different temperatures, sweating in steam rooms, or plunging into cold basins. To the bather it seemed effortless, the pools full, the fountains splashing, the heat constant. Yet all of it depended on aqueducts delivering millions of gallons each day, on reservoirs kept clean, on valves inspected, on leaks sealed. If lime had clogged a channel upstream, if a crack had widened in an arch, the baths might have run dry, and the crowds would have noticed immediately. Thus, the monotony of men scraping deposits miles away was in fact the foundation of Roman leisure. Water also supported sanitation, though in ways less celebrated. Latrines in Rome, often communal, required steady flows to wash away waste into the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer. The flush of water, ordinary and unremarkable, depended on the aqueduct system as surely as the baths did. Imagine the monotony of workers clearing weeds from channels while, back in the city, latrines were cleaned without a thought given to those unseen labors. Even the most basic act of cleanliness, the washing of hands before meals, the rinsing of fruit, the filling of a cup, was sustained by water that had traveled miles over arches and through tunnels, its journey protected by monotonous maintenance. For the wealthy, private water supplies granted luxury. Lead pipes carried streams directly into villas, filling ornamental fountains in courtyards or feeding small private baths. These pipes, however, were prone to leakage and corrosion, requiring regular inspection. If a crack went unnoticed, the household's flow diminished, and complaints rose swiftly to officials. The water may have been silent, but the absence of water was not. Thus, inspectors and workers endured their monotonous rounds, not only to keep Rome alive, but also to keep its citizens content. Consider also the role of water in religion and symbolism. Fountains decorated with statues were dedicated to nymphs and gods, and rituals of purification required fresh water. The aqueducts, though secular structures, enabled these sacred practices. Without their endless maintenance, even the gods of Rome would have seemed silent. And yet, through all this, the workers were invisible. A Roman might admire the arches of the Aqua Claudia on a distant hill, but he gave no thought to the man who climbed those arches with mortar to patch a leak. A citizen might dip a jug into a fountain each morning without realizing that men had scraped lime deposits the week before to keep the flow strong. The monotony of maintenance supported the monotony of life, and together they created the stability that allowed Rome to flourish. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, picture a day in ancient Rome unfolding, fountains gurgling in neighborhoods, baths steaming with crowds, kitchens busy with boiling pots, children splashing water on dusty faces. All of it seems ordinary, yet behind it stood an army of unseen men who endured endless repetition so that the eternal city might drink, wash, and live. Their names are lost, but their monotony echoes quietly in every drop that flowed. As the centuries passed and the strength of Rome began to falter, the aqueducts that had once stood as symbols of endurance and precision faced the slow burden of neglect. And the monotony of maintenance, once steady and reliable, became irregular, interrupted by shortages of funds, political instability, and the crumbling authority of officials who no longer commanded the same reach across the empire. In the days of Augustus or Trajan, money and manpower were available to keep aqueducts flowing. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, when Rome was beset by invasions, plagues, and economic strain, fewer resources were devoted to the constant, unglamorous work of scraping lime, patching cracks, and rebuilding arches. The equerri and their supervisors still trudged along channels, but their numbers were fewer, their tools worn, their pay uncertain. Imagine a worker in the late Empire, walking a section of the Aqua Marcia, noticing a leak widening in the mortar, knowing it should be patched, but lacking enough lime or enough men to make the repair. He writes a report, but the clerk who receives it has no funds to authorize action, and the leak continues. Water still flows, but less steadily, less cleanly, and in time, entire neighborhoods begin to notice shortages. At the same time, enemies outside the city learned that aqueducts, once marvels, were also vulnerabilities. Invasions by Goths or Vandals sometimes targeted aqueduct lines, cutting them deliberately to weaken the city within. When these breaches occurred, maintenance crews scrambled to repair them, but war and instability made the task nearly impossible. The monotony of daily repair became punctuated by the chaos of destruction, and often the latter one. Earthquakes too left their mark, toppling arches that once would have been swiftly rebuilt, but now lay in ruins for years because no one had the means to restore them. The grandeur of Rome's baths diminished as water supplies grew unreliable. Great complexes that had once consumed rivers of water each day stood increasingly empty, their pools dry, their marble floors cracked. Public fountains sputtered, sometimes dry for weeks at a time, and the people who once took for granted the steady gurgle of water began to complain. Yet the complaints changed nothing, for emperors were consumed with military crises and shifting capitals, moving authority away from Rome itself. The monotony of maintenance, always invisible, was now doubly forgotten, dismissed in a world where survival seemed more urgent than steady water flow. Consider the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, once flushed regularly by aqueduct water. As supply dwindled, waste stagnated, and disease spread more easily. What had once been a triumph of sanitation decayed into a source of filth. The quiet work of workers patching, scraping, and clearing no longer kept pace with the scale of decline. And yet, even in this fading world, some men still walked the aqueduct lines, still scraped lime with worn chisels, still hauled mortar up crumbling arches, their efforts stubborn, repetitive, and unheralded. They could not stop the tide of history, but they continued their tasks, day after day, mile after mile, fighting against time. Picture one of these men, standing on a broken arcade, staring out across fields where stones from fallen arches lay scattered, feeling the futility of his work, and yet still lifting his hammer to strike away deposits in a channel that barely flowed. The monotony remained, but without order, without oversight, it became a struggle against inevitability. By the 5th century, when barbarian invasions sacked Rome, many aqueducts were left unrepaired, their channels broken, their waters lost. The Eternal City, once sustained by the constant murmur of flowing aqueducts, shrank in population, and the great baths closed. The monotony of maintenance had always been invisible, but now its absence was visible in silence, in dry fountains, in abandoned cisterns. Tonight, as you drift deeper into stillness, imagine those aqueducts under moonlight, their arches still standing but their channels dry, the ghosts of workers lingering in memory, their endless scraping and patching no longer enough to hold back decline. The story of Rome's aqueducts reminds us that endurance is not eternal, but depends on constant, humble repetition. And when that repetition falters, even the greatest marvels fade. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, the aqueducts that had once carried life into the heart of the Eternal City entered a new chapter of slow decay, neglect, and uneasy survival. For centuries, they had been sustained by the monotony of constant maintenance, by workers who scraped lime, patched cracks, and walked their long routes day after day. But with the fall of centralized authority, that rhythm faltered and eventually broke. The Gothic sieges of Rome in the early 5th and 6th centuries targeted aqueducts deliberately, cutting their flows to starve the city of water, and once broken, many channels were never fully restored. Without officials to oversee crews, without funds to pay for mortar, stone, and labor, the aqueducts that had seemed eternal began to dry. Imagine walking through Rome in the 6th century, the grand baths of Caracalla silent and empty, fountains reduced to trickles or standing dry, cisterns gathering dust. The Cloaca Maxima no longer flushed as it once was. Ordinary citizens, no longer able to rely on public fountains, turned to wells or drew water directly from the Tiber, a river that was polluted and unpredictable. Disease spread more easily, hygiene declined, and the old rhythms of Roman urban life faded away. Yet the aqueducts did not vanish overnight. Their arches still spanned valleys, their channels still traced lines across hillsides, reminders of a grandeur that no longer functioned. In some places, local communities made small repairs, patching sections to bring water to fields or villages. But these efforts were modest compared to the grand system that once fed a million souls. More often, the structures were quarried for stone. Blocks of travertine and tufa that had once supported water were pried loose and reused in churches, fortifications, and simple houses. Lead pipes, once carrying precious flows, were melted down for other purposes. The monotony of maintenance was replaced by the monotony of scavenging, as the ruins of Rome became resources for those trying to survive in a diminished world. In time, monks and local rulers recognized the usefulness of some surviving aqueduct sections and redirected their water to monasteries or small settlements. But the scale was always smaller, the ambition humbler. Rome itself, shrinking in size and population, no longer needed or could sustain the sprawling network it once possessed. Travelers in the Middle Ages wrote of great arches standing like silent skeletons across the countryside, their channels empty, their stones weathered, their purpose forgotten. For those who walked among them, they seemed more like ruins of myth than practical machines of water. Yet even in ruin, they were not entirely without use. Shepherds sheltered beneath arches, farmers planted fields in their shadows, pilgrims marveled at their endurance. And sometimes, in rare cases, small communities patched sections enough to bring a trickle of water to fields or gardens. The aqueducts had shifted from being arteries of empire to being fragments of local utility. The silence of neglect was profound. Where once men had walked daily with chisels and brushes, now weeds grew unchecked in channels, moss filled cracks, and rainwater pooled uselessly in broken troughs. The monotony of maintenance had been replaced by the monotony of nature reclaiming stone. Birds nested in crevices, ivy climbed walls, and the steady work of centuries was undone by the steady passage of time. And yet, even in this decline, the structures stood as reminders of what had once been achieved. Travelers and chroniclers in later centuries would gaze on them with awe, wondering how such grandeur could have been built, unaware of the anonymous men who had once kept them alive, with endless scraping and patching. Tonight, as you let your mind rest, imagine walking through a field where an aqueduct still stands, its arches tall but broken, its channel dry. Silence surrounds it, broken only by wind, by the call of birds, by the rustle of grass. Once it carried the lifeblood of a great city, sustained by monotonous labor, but now it stands in quiet ruin, a testament to both human ingenuity and the fragility of all things that depend on constant care. The fall of Rome was not only a political event, it was also the slow silencing of water, the end of monotony, and the beginning of decay. Though many aqueducts of Rome fell silent after the collapse of the Western Empire, their monumental forms remained, silent guardians over valleys and hillsides, waiting through centuries of neglect, until new hands and new ages found reason to restore or repurpose them. In the long centuries of the Middle Ages, Rome itself was a diminished city, its population reduced to a fraction of its imperial peak, and the need for vast flows of water was gone. Wells, springs, and the river Tiber supplied enough for a smaller population, and the grandeur of aqueduct-fed baths and fountains belonged to memory. Yet the aqueducts did not vanish. Their stones still stood, their arches still cast shadows. Some monasteries and local rulers patched fragments to bring trickles of water to cloisters or gardens. A few channels were reused to irrigate fields, humble functions for structures once designed to supply marble baths and monumental fountains. Travelers in the Middle Ages wrote of aqueducts with awe and puzzlement, uncertain how such works had been built, imagining them the product of giants or of lost ancient wisdom. The monotony of maintenance that had once been so constant was gone, replaced by centuries of silence, but the endurance of the stones kept memory alive. When the Renaissance dawned, with its hunger to recover the knowledge and glory of antiquity, the aqueducts became symbols of Rome's past greatness and inspirations for renewal. Popes, seeking to restore the city's dignity, ordered repairs to some surviving lines. The Aqua Virgo, originally built in 19 BCE, was one of the few aqueducts to continue supplying water through the Middle Ages, and in the Renaissance, it was restored to feed new fountains, culminating centuries later in the Baroque splendor of the Trevi Fountain. Other aqueducts were partially rebuilt or redirected, not to their original scale, but enough to serve the needs of a growing papal city. The monotony of maintenance returned in a new form, not legions of imperial workers, but smaller crews employed by the papacy, patching ancient channels, clearing deposits, and reviving a flow that connected the Rome of the present to the Rome of the Caesars. Artists and architects studied the ruins of aqueducts, sketching their arches and learning from their engineering. They became not only sources of water, but sources of inspiration, reminders of proportion, durability, and the marriage of function and form. As centuries passed into the modern age, the aqueducts continued to stand, some still carrying water, others left as ruins, but admired as monuments. The monotony of daily scraping and patching had long ended, replaced by the monotony of preservation. Archaeologists cataloging stones, masons stabilizing arches, guides repeating the same explanations to countless visitors. What had once been living infrastructure was now heritage, a silent story retold in every photograph, every tour, every careful restoration. Yet the essence remains the same. Aqueducts endure only through constant human attention, whether to carry water or to preserve memory. Tonight, as you let your breathing slow, picture those ancient arches stretching across the Roman countryside, bathed in golden evening light, their stones weathered but still proud. Imagine workers of long ago, chiseling lime deposits, carrying mortar, climbing scaffolds, never imagining that their monotonous labor would be remembered millennia later, not in their names, but in the survival of the arches themselves. The monotony of Roman aqueduct maintenance has become history's whisper, reminding us that even the grandest achievements rely on quiet, repetitive acts of care. Today, the aqueducts stand as both ruins and marvels, silent testaments to endurance, fragility, and the power of persistence. They no longer carry lifeblood into the city as they once did, but they still carry meaning, flowing not with water, but with memory. and their quiet presence speaks across the centuries to all who pause to listen. Before we end tonight's story, let me gently remind you of something simple. Try not to go to bed with a heavy stomach, for rest comes easier when the body feels light. And if you can, set your phone aside and give your eyes and mind a moment of calm. Away from glowing screens. Let your breath slow, let your thoughts settle, and allow yourself to drift. Small habits like these can ease you into deeper, more peaceful sleep. Thank you for choosing to spend your quiet time here with me. I wish you calm dreams and a gentle night until we meet again tomorrow at Sleep Whisper.